name's Meg, and I am the owner and creative director behind So Liberated Sewing Patterns. And today we are going to show you how to take our popular Hinterland dress pattern and draft a really fun quilted vest for yourself using just a basic dress bodice, which is our Hinterland dress. You can find the pattern linked below, as well as a few other blogs for taking your hack in different ways. If you are unfamiliar with pattern hacking or pattern making principles in general, a vest hack is a really great place to start, because you have so many options when it comes to modifying it to your liking. So Judith, who is our pattern maker here at So Liberated, who's going to be walking you through step by step how to make this vest hack. She has a slightly different outcome than mine, because when I went through the hack, I said to myself, I want mine to be a little longer, a little wider here. I want to have some curves at the bottom. So I want to encourage you to watch through this tutorial and kind of get a sense of the process of it, and then go ahead and make your own decisions and get creative with it. You can make this hack your own. I encourage you at a certain point, once you have your paper pattern drafted, to go ahead and at least try on your paper pattern. So, make sure that it's gonna fit you, that it has the kind of lines that you're wanting. You can make a muslin out of it and then try on that, very simple, basic vest before you go into using your precious fabric with it. A vest is a super forgiving first step if you've never hacked a sewing pattern or if you've never done any sort of pattern making before. Super great first step, and it creates a really fun, wearable, easy fit final garment. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Judith, who is going to show you what you need to draft your hack.
You may have seen a vest like this before. Meredith made one last year, and today's tutorial is about how to use the Hinterland bodice to create your own vest pattern. You'll need to start with the Hinterland bodice. We'll use the sleeveless bodice, just the front and the back pieces. That's all we'll need. You'll also need to know what sort of edge finishing you're planning. Maybe you're going to be using binding like I did, or maybe you're going to be sewing the pieces together and turning them right side out. That's a plan that you need to make in this point of your pattern making process, so that all of your seam allowances and those decisions can be made with that information in mind. You'll also need to know what type of closure you're planning and the size of that closure so that you can draft appropriately. So make sure you're paying attention to what decisions you're making as you go, and make notes, because future you really wants you to have notes. For your materials, you can use quilting cotton scraps. You can use garment fabric scraps like I did. I have some dress fabric, some poplin, some linen scraps from other projects. I also have some cotton quilt batting inside of my vest, and I used pre-made bias binding. I'll set my vest aside and take out the pattern pieces. I have the sleeveless back bodice and the sleeveless front bodice, and I have my usual pattern making supplies. If you're a student in the Creative Hinterland, you're already really familiar with this setup. You've seen me do this so many times before, and you know that I encourage you to use a mechanical pencil when you're drafting, because the graphite is very small and it makes a very narrow and precise line. So this is an excellent choice for drafting because it's really accurate. When I'm on camera, I use a fine tip Sharpie so that you can see what I'm doing. To begin with these bodice pieces, we're going to think about the bodice length, and then we're going to look at the dart. Having a dart on a quilted garment can be a little bit impractical, so we're going to get rid of it. But we're going to start on the back piece. So the first thing that we're going to do is lengthen the back piece. This bodice is going to be lengthened just an inch for a really cropped look. So what I'm doing is I'm lining up the lines on my ruler with the sewing line. This is the special edition pattern from the Creative Hinterland bodice. So I have the cut lines and the stitching lines, the seam lines, are on my pattern piece. So if you don't have this special edition pattern, you should be marking in with your pencil where the stitching lines are so that you can work on the seam lines, not the cut lines of your pattern piece. So you can see here I've marked 1 inch of added length. And because I know that I'm using bias binding, I don't need seam allowances on my finished edges. So I don't need a hem allowance. So there's my 1 inch marking here. And I'm not going to finish the 1 inch marking at the side seam yet because I need to finish up with the front piece first. So the next thing I want to do is, you know what, I'll just mark it off for now, is remove the seam allowances all the way around the arm's eye and the neckline. We don't need those. And then I'll true this up in a minute because these are also going to be bound edges. So I'll mark in my 1 inch of added length on the front bodice. And I'm not making it perfect yet because I'm not finished. So now I want to convert the dart to ease. I would rather have a more loosely fitting bodice than have to sew a dart into the quilting. So that's what I'm going to do. Now to make this line parallel to the grain line, my 2 inch ruler is not quite wide enough to meet the grain line. So I'm going to double up here because I want to make sure that my line is parallel to the grain line. See how my ruler is lining up with the grain line? So now I can mark from the bust point down to the waist. And I'm going to grab a little bit of paper from over here. Because I'll need that in a minute. I'm going to cut the dart out entirely, just so that you can see how the intake looks when it's divided. And I'm going to cut up to the bust apex. And I'll cut from the waist right up to the bust apex as well. Now I'm trying to leave a little hinge so that this piece can pivot. And what I want to do is distribute the dart intake half and half. So half at the side seam and half at the waist. And it's not quite there. So you can measure the opening like this and divide it in half, or you can grab your dart intake and you can measure across the dart intake. And so I have 1 and 7/8, or if you want easier math, you can switch to metric, and I've got 4.8 centimeters. So now half of that dart intake is going to be here at the waist, 2.4 centimeters, or a 1/16 shy of 1 inch. And now I can tape this in place. So I'm going to grab my extra paper in a minute, but I just wanted my black table to show you the negative space. See how half of the dart intake is here and half is here. Now the extra paper is in place and it's all nice and secure. Next, I need to redraw the side seam and the bottom seam to be straight. Because we're ignoring the dart intake, we've got some weird jogs happening here. And so we just need to make it smooth because we're going to join the side seams without a dart now. So here's my new side seam. And I'm just connecting from the underarm to the waist and then blending along that line. So I do need to make sure that I have a seam allowance on the side seam because the side seams are sewn together. And then along the waist, squaring off from the side seam so that it will at least start with a nice smooth line. And then I'm just double checking, making a smooth line. Oh, I actually forgot what I was doing. I need to be working on my new waist, my lowered waistline. Okay, just gonna grab my curved ruler, make a little gentle line. Okay, and remember when you're working, if you've got some extra lines and it's getting a little bit messy, use some hash marks so that you don't get confused about which line you should be following. Okay, so now my dart is converted to ease, and I've lowered the waistline by 1 inch. I'm going to bring the back bodice back in and just make sure that the waist is going to line up nicely. Now you can't see through my paper on camera, but I can. I can see where the line for the waist is right here, and I can see the line of the underarm right here, and this is my side seam of the back. So I'm just going to line them up and the side seam on the front. You can see that my waist seam is not lining up at all. So I'm going to tape this in place temporarily. And it's not lining up because of this extra ease right here. So what I'm going to do is sort of go about half and half. So here's the waist on the back, and there's the waist on the front. So I'm going to let them join about there. That will be nice. So now I can use my ruler and neaten this up. And if I go a little bit slowly, the ink will soak through the paper so I can transfer this to the right side of my back pattern piece. And now I can continue along the front. You can see why learning how to use hash marks is really important, because I now have quite a few lines for this waist seam. Okay. So in order to get this waist nice and smooth, I've only added 7/8 of inch of length to the 7/8 of an inch of length to the front, and that's fine with me. So now there's my new waist for the back. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this while I've got it here. Because that was it for the back pattern piece. And remember, you still need the side seam allowance. Let's think about the closure method. I want to use probably buttons. I'm thinking of using 5/8 of an inch buttons. You could also use snaps. I think Meg might be planning on using snaps, and a standard snap circumference is also 5/8 of an inch. So I think we're going to go with 5/8 for the width. And it's important to know the size of your closure because your overlap amount on the front, the extension, is determined by the size of the closure that you're going to use. So if you're going to use a zipper and you want to sew the edges on flush, then you actually are going to remove maybe like 1/4 of an inch. If you're going to use nothing, or if you're going to use ties and you want the edges to just meet up against each other, then you're not going to change and you're just going to use the center front of the pattern piece. But because I'm using a snap or a button, then I need to have an overlap. And so here's the math for the overlap. The magical thing about the Hinterland bodice is that the center front of the pattern piece is actually the center front of the bodice. That's how that placket math works out. So it's really, really handy. This line is indeed the center front. So if I were to use a 1-inch button, I would want a 1-inch extension on the center front. And then when the button is sewn on right on the center front line, then there would be 1/2 an inch of fabric between the edge of the button and the finished edge of the front. So it's a really handy guideline to remember. Okay, so we know that we're working with a 5/8 of an inch sized closure method, either buttons or snaps. So the extension is going to be 5/8 of an inch past the center front. Now, because once again, we're binding, so we don't need to have an extra seam allowance past that. So that makes that really easy. And then the only thing that we have to think about next is the neckline. So this is the pattern piece that Meg wants, and she does not want me to raise the neckline at all. So we're going to leave the neckline as it is, but we're going to shape it so that the neckline doesn't have too hard of a curve, because sewing binding around a curve that's too sharp can be really difficult. So if you take a look here at mine, you can see that there's a little bit of bubbling here because it's hard to sew binding around a curve that's really small. So if this curve had been even tighter, then the binding would have been even trickier to sew. So when it's a gradual curve, it's much easier to sew. So we want to make sure that we're making it as natural and like mindless to sew as possible so that it's not too difficult. So I'm going to pick up my pencil and just put in a gentle shaping, and then I'll tidy this up with my ruler in just a minute. So this is a way that I like to sort of think on paper rather than going right in there with my marker, making it permanent. Taking the pencil and just going gently. Give me a chance to think about it. So this is good. And it's fairly close to the original neckline, which is what Meg prefers. So now I'll just take my marker and my curved ruler and mark this in. Now I'm being pretty bold about this because I already have made this pattern once for myself. So if it takes you a little bit longer than it takes me on camera, don't worry about it. This is my second round, so I've already learned from my mistakes on the first round. And I do this for a living, so if your hands aren't confident, that's okay. A bit of trial and error, and you're going to be just fine. So let me grab my eraser and get rid of some of these pencil markings, and then you can see how this looks. It's beautiful. So remember, I was working off of the seam line here at the neck, and the seam allowance gets cut off because it's bound. So the binding is going to go up the center front, around the neckline, and then down the center front. Then there's another piece of binding that goes around the hemline, and then each of the arm sides are bound individually as well. So it's 4 separate pieces of binding to get all of the edges done. And that's it. It's as simple as that. That's the pattern piece. This is the front with the dart converted into ease, and then the back with some added length. So the next thing I would do is line up the front and the back to make sure that the curves of the neckline are correct. And I already know they are because they're from my fit bodice and I already trued them up then. So that's it for the pattern work. My next steps are to cut out the front that I just finished and also to trace off a copy, especially if I'm going to want to do any piecework like Meredith's tutorial shows you how to use the Ohio Star quilt block, which is really beautiful. And if you want to do that, make sure you trace off your pattern piece. If you're going to be making any changes after this, having a fresh copy to work from will just make sure that you can maintain the ability to work backwards and also have the correct pattern piece for the outer shell and for the quilt batting and for the lining, because you'll need an uncut piece for those two. So maybe I'll see you again in another lesson soon. Bye for now.
I hope you're feeling excited about the possibilities with pattern hacking. And if you're just dying for more and want to take your skills and build on them further, I highly suggest you check out our Creative Hinterland course. This is a beginning pattern making course that'll teach you 12 hacks that start from simple to more advanced, that take our Hinterland dress pattern, and you can draft 12 completely new designs. By the end of it, you will feel confident to take any sewing pattern and hack it to your liking. So again, the link is below. It's called the Creative Hinterland course, and Judith teaches it. It's really wonderful. Be sure to share your quilted vest hacks. You can simply hashtag Hinterland hack on social media, and that will pop up in our feeds, and we would love to see what you make with this hack. So happy creative sewing.